Hello and welcome to Carnegie's event on launching our latest report on Israel-Palestine, breaking the Israel-Palestine status quo. This is part of a series of work that Carnegie has done in the last 3 to 4 years, where we have been ahead of the debate in Washington about possible solutions to the Arab-Israeli conflict. We have published reports in 2017 and 2018 on revitalizing Palestinian nationalism, on whether we have a one-state or two-state solution. In all these reports, we have attempted to look at developments on the ground and attempted also to survey opinions of particularly young Palestinians under occupation for what they see as possible solution to the conflict. And in all these reports, what we have seen is a clear trend away from focusing on the shape of a solution to focusing on rights. Palestinians are increasingly looking at their rights as opposed to what shape of a solution they're going to end up with. This latest report, Breaking the Israel-Palestine Status Quo, centers its main arguments about a rights-based approach. And that approach to us is compatible with any shape of a solution. Whether the solution ends up to be a two-state solution or a one-state solution is not the objective of this report. The shape of the solution is an organic process. It has to come up organically, and it has to be negotiated among the parties themselves. What we are saying in the report is that from now on, any approach to breaking the impasse on Israel-Palestine needs to center around rights of both Palestinians and Israelis, the human security of both communities, and rights that are looked at equally between the two communities. The problem with the traditional approaches to peacemaking as far as Israel-Palestine is concerned is that by focusing on the shape alone, the international community has tended to ignore the rights of the communities on the ground, and particularly the rights of people under occupation, that is the Palestinians. This report, we hope, is going to help start a conversation among the different policymakers, decision makers, among civil society about possible solutions, rather than be bound by traditional approaches to peacemaking that have basically failed so far in achieving a solution to the conflict. With me today are two of the co-authors of the report, Zaha Hassan and Daniel Levy, who will take us through the details of the report and its main recommendations. The report is going to be, is actually published already online. You can see it online on the Carnegie website. And next week, it will also be available online in Arabic, and we will have a similar launch in Arabic next week. To help have a discussion about the main recommendations, we have a very distinguished panel moderated by the Washington Post Ishaan Theroux, and including Lara Friedman, Salih and Khaled Elgindy. I will leave it to Ishaan to introduce the panelists and then to lead the discussion and the questions and answers from you all. So with that, let me turn it over to Zaha and Daniel to discuss the report's main recommendations.
Thank you, Marwan, and thank you all for joining us on the launch of this paper. Ramadan Kareem for those observing. The paper we're sharing with you today, Breaking the Israel-Palestine Status Quo, provides policy recommendations and an approach for the Biden administration and for future administrations to consider towards conflict resolution between Palestinians and Israelis. The report is one that focuses on the long game rather than on short-term measures or palliatives. If there's anything that experts on Israel-Palestine and policymakers agree on, it's this: there is no two-state solution open for the taking at the moment. And likewise, a one-state solution that offers equal rights for all is just as unlikely. But that doesn't mean there's nothing to be done. The paper offers some tangible and doable policy prescriptions for this administration to adopt. Before I get into the substance of the report itself, I want to tell you about how we developed the recommendations, because I think that's very important. For over a year and a half, we gathered a group of 25 to 30 experts from diverse professional backgrounds and personal experiences to discuss the state of U.S. policy toward Palestine, Israel, and what it had achieved and where it had failed and why. And we also discussed how the U.S. approach might be recalibrated for better outcomes. The people we were in dialogue with included people who had served in government and worked on the file, analysts, representatives from organizations working on Israel-Palestine peace, and those from within the human rights community. In addition, we had roundtables and conducted personal interviews with people and organizations working in the region. Our way of going about preparing the policy paper was deliberate. We came at this with the understanding that rarely do people most affected by U.S. policy get an opportunity to play an active part in developing that policy. The most impacted are usually the marginalized, particularly refugee populations and women. In the case of Palestine, Israel, even Palestinian national bodies and their representatives are among the marginalized, particularly so during the last administration. What the co-authors of this report heard in the consultations we conducted about what was needed from U.S. engagement were the following. First, center rights and human security. Second, roll back Trump administration actions and its Peace to Prosperity plan in its entirety and reaffirm the importance of international law and peacemaking. Third, clarify the expectations that the administration has for Israelis as well as Palestinians and back those up with the levers of U.S. policy. And fourth, work collaboratively with multilateral mechanisms and the UN so the rules-based international order is strengthened rather than undermined by U.S. engagement on a durable solution for Israelis and Palestinians. Now, I want to hone in on the recommendation in the policy paper to center rights and human security. What do I mean by that? Something we refer to in the paper as a rights-based approach. We mean that there has been a deprioritization of rights and international law when thinking about a solution to the conflict. In fact, policymakers have tended to believe that a focus on rights and freedoms guaranteed under international law, rights and freedoms contained in documents like the Fourth Geneva Convention or the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which the U.S. was instrumental in drafting, would kill the chances for Israel to come to the negotiating table. The result was that settlement expansion was incentivized. Why should Israel stop building if it knew that the issue could be leveraged by promising to engage in a new round of negotiations, or if it knew that the U.S. would ultimately accommodate its new facts on the ground by redefining peace parameters while also shielding Israel from accountability in international fora? But when we talk about centering rights, it isn't only the rights of Palestinians vis-a-vis the state of Israel, the occupying power. It's also about rights Israelis and Palestinians have vis-a-vis their own representative bodies. The warped incentive structure I just mentioned also impacts Israeli governance and empowers ultranationalist parties. The trend lines in Israel are in the direction of greater authoritarianism and denial of civil liberties and equal protection. The resurgence of parties advocating Jewish supremacy have been mainstreamed. That these political parties now have seats in the Knesset should be alarming, but it shouldn't be surprising. In the occupied territories, the Palestinian Authority and the PLO have also sacrificed the rights and well-being of Palestinians in an attempt to conform to the image of a good peace partner. The Palestinian leadership has prioritized the peace process over working to strengthen the political and social cohesion of Palestinian society. The PA also has played to international donors and been led by donor support for state building under occupation, rather than working to promote sustainable development or ways to support Palestinian families trying to stay in their homes and on their land. To please donors and wanting to maintain power, the ruling party Fatah sacrificed nascent Palestinian democracy rather than seeking ways to make political space for factions in opposition to it, based on a commitment to respect norms rather than on agreements with Israel that Israel has never fully implemented or been committed to. So what happens when we center rights? Do we all of a sudden get a peace agreement and a two-state solution or one-state solution with equality for all arrives? Of course not. We're not saying that. I mean, what centering rights does do is it changes the political calculations of the parties so that over time, they are encouraged to recalibrate and rethink their actions vis-a-vis each other and vis-a-vis their own constituencies. And when that happens, we have a much better chance of creating an environment conducive for meaningful negotiations that can produce a durable solution. Now I want to be clear on what this paper does not say, because I know there will be those who misinterpret our recommendations. We do not call for an end to the two-state solution, and we do not call for a one-state solution. We don't advocate any solution. In fact, we only call for the U.S. to make clear to Israel, its close ally and to whom it provides considerable material support, that as Israel continues to foreclose a two-state solution, that the U.S. will only support an outcome that ensures equal rights for all those living under Israel's control and jurisdiction. Second, we don't call for more U.S. engagement. In fact, we call for less, but smarter engagement. We argue that the U.S. will have to expend more and more of its time and energy defending Israel in international fora, including in places like the International Criminal Court, if it doesn't adopt a rights-based approach now. Third, we don't call for the U.S. to be an arbiter between Israelis and Palestinians. We simply call for the U.S. to recalibrate its own policies and how it uses its levers of influence with the parties. Fourth, we are not putting undue focus on Israel. We are de-exceptionalizing Israel so that U.S. foreign policy is consistent on human rights promotion and respects the rules-based order, values that the Biden administration has indicated it seeks to restore and elevate in its national security strategy. Fifth, we reject the idea that a rights-based approach undermines U.S. interests in the region. Arguably, it's been the lack of a centering of rights and human security in Israel-Palestine that has undermined U.S. interests for so many years. Recalibrating the U.S. approach now would restore U.S. credibility. It pulls the rug out from under U.S. adversary, and it enables the U.S. to reestablish respect for multilateral mechanisms that it once engaged in the resolution of other regional conflicts. And finally, we also reject the notion that the paper is out of touch with domestic realities. We know from polling year after year that most American voters aren't prioritizing Palestine and Israel in their voting choice. They look at the package of values a candidate represents. And we know that 2/3 of Americans would like to see a neutral U.S. policy towards Israel-Palestine. Interestingly, in March of this year, Gallup polling showed that a majority of those from the Democratic Party, 53%, want the U.S. to put more pressure on Israel to make peace, a 10% increase from just a couple of years ago. However, the changes taking place in the electorate are not being reflected in U.S. policy yet, and that's the reality. And with that, I will pass it over to my partner in this project, Daniel Levy.
Thank you so much, Zaha, and those who've helped and worked with us on the project, not least Marwan yourself. I'm just going to build on what Zaha has just offered us and perhaps emphasize half a dozen points as we kind of go into a discussion about the paper. Firstly, as Zaha has said already, we are not suggesting the US invest more time, effort, and resources on this issue. We get the priorities of any administration that would come into office today, both domestically and internationally. What we are saying in this respect is twofold. First, that you can actually get more for less, that the current policy is both not cost-free and counterproductive. Those who defend something like the status quo ante and criticize from that angle should at least have an accurate assessment of what the current policy costs in diplomatic time and effort globally, whether that be in the UN or other international fora, where the US is guaranteeing policies that it actually claims to disagree with. And in the region, if you just look at the US down payments that went into achieving those normalization or Abraham Accords over the past months and the last months of the previous administration. Second point, I'm very aware that a change of course carries a domestic political cost. But I would argue that a change is only going to become less avoidable but more costly the longer the US continues down this path, which guarantees deteriorating terms of engagement. And that's the reframing we're trying to offer, and that Zaha has outlined for us in delving into what, with humility, we're calling a rights-based approach, and others have used the phrase. So if one continues to emphasize a thoroughly atrophied and structurally incapable of delivering peace process, tinkering with territory, areas A, B, C, ignoring the dignity of people on the ground, their rights and freedoms, and especially the unconscionable predicament of Palestinians in Gaza, then you only store up more problems for the US in the future. I'm not saying that where we are on the immigration debate, for instance, in America, where a Democrat administration that makes the kind of statement it made on quotas last week had to retract that statement. I'm not saying we're there on Palestine, Israel, but you can see the direction of travel of something that was easier to deal with many years ago just becomes more costly, more difficult. It should matter, and I believe it does matter, that the blue chip human rights organizations in Palestine and Israel have made a designation of the reality on the ground being one of apartheid, and the global human rights organizations are apparently not far behind. So business as usual, I think, is a hard thing for a Democrat administration, increasingly hard to pull off. And yes, point 3, we are saying roll back the egregious excesses of the Trump administration, but that the rollback isn't enough because there's no golden era to return to. And the often suggested baby steps, this is the realistic thing, do baby steps, they all ultimately crystallize around the kind of economic peace efforts that have been tried and they've failed for structural reasons, not because of lack of goodwill or good intent. They've failed because of relations of power. And if you don't address those, and if the US exacerbates that asymmetry, there's ever less value in investing in those. Fourth point, we're not saying that the US does or should own this problem or resolve the problem. As Zaha said, Israelis and Palestinians themselves carry primary responsibility and agency, but we argue the US should desist from policies that make it so much more difficult for a politics and discourse that is rights respecting and peace promoting to breathe amongst Palestinians and Israelis. And my familiarity is in particular with developments in Israel. And I witnessed the distorting effect of a policy that empowers hardliners and increasingly ever more extremists. And that's very pronounced inside Israel, that the incentive structure has been turned upside down. If US policy effectively guarantees no consequences and no accountability, for instance, for illegal settlements, then one shouldn't be surprised that in the duration of the peace process, there has been a quadrupling of settler numbers in the West Bank alone. And so my penultimate point is to be clear that we are not suggesting that US-Israel relations be placed in the category of relations with Iran or Cuba or Iraq under Saddam. Also, to be clear, I think the weaponization of the US Treasury and of sanctions has been a bad policy with disastrous consequences for the civilians in those places I mentioned. But the point here is that the choice on offer is not a binary where one has to choose between maximum pressure or maximum impunity. Maximum impunity skews the Israeli public discourse and decision making. What is needed is a policy of non-complicity, the withdrawal of impunity. I'd even say calibrated non-complicity with Israeli policies that are illegal, that undermine peace, that deny rights. And we've had mentioned already, and I won't go further into it, the distorting impact on the Palestinian side, encouraging a system that is more securitized, that undermines democracy for Palestinians, that doesn't allow representativeness. Again, it's for Palestinians to have their elections, to renew their system, but it's for the US to support and encourage rather than add obstacles. So finally, point 6, there are things that are actionable. in the short term in this paper, things that we even see some movement on in the administration, like resuming funding for UNRWA. But there are others that will, of course, require success in this kind of reframing, constituency building and mobilizing international partners, and, you know, breaking news. There is movement. This is happening. We know that. The discourse is shifting. The polling that was already referenced bears that out. So we're trying to offer a new scaffolding, new building blocks for peace, because the existing scaffolding is collapsing in front of our eyes and cannot deliver. And in a way, I would like to think that this report is a modest contribution from within the policy think tank community, from within the blob, if you like, to catching up with reality. Thanks very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Daniel. With that, let me turn it over to Ishaan for the discussion.
I am so sorry, I was muted. Forgive me. Well, thank you all. Thank you, Marwan. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Zaha. And thank you to the audience for being here today. I encourage viewers to read the report. If you haven't yet, it's incredibly worth your time. My name is Ishaan Theroux. I'm a reporter at the Washington Post. And I'm delighted to be joined by, as was said, a distinguished panel. I'm joining me for a chat about the paper and the matter at hand are Lara Friedman, president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, Salih president of the Center for International Policy, and Khaled Elgindy, senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. All the panelists have very lengthy and important biographies, and I encourage you to look it up, but we're short of time, so let's get into it. Salih, let me start with you. This question of centering policy around rights, it's something we've heard a long time from people working around the Israeli-Palestinian issue. But how difficult do you see that as something that the American policy establishment can truly take on in this context? Are there any precedents as well for such recentering?
Well, certainly there are difficulties, and there are also precedents, but there's also this important historic moment, because it's not just a matter of think tanks making this important contribution, and I salute the authors of this report, because their singular contribution here is to recommend this centering on human rights. But it's also an important moment in terms of what's happening in this country, the largest mass movement in American history that's focused on what? Essentially, it's focused on ending American apartheid. And the focus of this movement is not just on ending racism and militarism in the United States, but beyond the US borders as well. So there is a social movement, an incredibly dynamic, large, and vigorous movement that embraces not just issues of racial equality, but also the climate movement, the migrant rights movement, labor, feminism, etc. And all have gathered around this priority of ending racism and militarism at home and abroad. So they will welcome this focus on human rights, to center US Israel-Palestine policy on human rights and their implications for that policy. A human rights-based approach is going to require an equal rights-based approach, ending this sort of racial hierarchy, placing a higher value on Israeli lives than on Palestinian lives. And this means prioritizing human rights and human security and ending American exceptionalism and, by extension, Israeli exceptionalism. So there's going to have to be also a greater scrutiny of the unlimited military support to Israel that is a major part of US foreign policy. The United States has provided Israel over $200 billion inflation adjusted in military, economic, and missile defense funding through last year, 2020, making Israel the largest cumulative recipient of US assistance since World War II. And US law is clear the observance and promotion of fundamental human rights are a cornerstone of US policy. The Biden administration wants to center all of its foreign policy on human rights, and therefore all countries receiving US aid must meet certain human rights standards, and countries violating these rights are liable to be sanctioned or to become ineligible for receiving US funding. So this is embedded in the Foreign Assistance Act, the Arms Export Control Act, the Leahy laws. And recently, Representative Betty Collum, a Democrat from Minnesota, has introduced a comprehensive legislation initiative on Palestinian rights. HR 2590, defending the human rights of Palestinian children and families living under Israeli military occupation. The legislation has broad co-sponsorship, including many leading members of the Black Caucus and the Hispanic Caucus and the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and is also supported by J Street. So I think what we're seeing is that this is the future. There is increasing public and congressional efforts to make US policies toward the Israel-Palestine conflict conform with US law, with US values, and with US human rights obligations.
Thank you. And just a note to the audience, if you have questions, I believe in the YouTube chat function where you're watching this event, you can start popping in your questions now. We'll eventually turn to them later in this conversation. Khaled, if I can move on to you. You heard what Salih just said about some of the energy that we're seeing being mobilized in Washington, perhaps in a somewhat unprecedented way. But the signals we've received so far from the Biden administration suggests that the Israel-Palestinian issue is on the back burner. It's not going to be something that they are devoting many resources to or any resources to. What kind of movement do you see from the Biden camp? And do you think under the current political conditions we have that this kind of recentering and real focus and the kind of political risks it takes to do that may come about?
Thanks, Ishaan. Let me try to tackle that second part first, and
Sure.
that is to sort of echo the point that Daniel made about this asymmetry of power, and it's really that asymmetry which has actually grown. The imbalance in power between Israelis and Palestinians has grown since the start of the peace process, and that's pretty much the opposite of what a peace process is supposed to do. It's that asymmetry that fuels and drives conflict and instability. As long as one side, of course, has is able to subjugate the other side with impunity, as we heard. And so a rights-based approach is really the only way to deal with that power asymmetry that fuels conflict. Otherwise, you are left to simple power dynamics and might makes right. And of course, we know the results of what that leads to. As far as the Biden administration in particular, we are seeing, of course, a commitment to reversing some of the worst aspects of the previous administration's policies. Most notably, we've seen the resumption of aid, a fairly modest amount, I think something like 235 million, a large chunk of which is for UNRWA, which is politically important because of the way the UNRWA has been targeted and politicized along with the refugee issue in general. And so those were things that, the administration, I think, calculated they would take some political hits, and they did, but they weren't, of course, life-threatening. They weren't earth-shattering. They were manageable. And yet, the approach that we're seeing, both with regard to re-engaging with the issue, obviously, you said, as you noted, they have very modest goals. They have other priorities, but also because this is a politically difficult issue in terms of American domestic politics. And so we see this re-engagement, but at the same time, it's being done in a very minimalistic and often accompanied with sort of vagaries and occasionally even sort of mealy-mouthed statements from the State Department. But I don't want to, I don't want to diminish these policy reversals, which are important, but they are kind of bare bones and the absolute minimum. Why that's problematic is because the other side, opponents of Oslo and opponents of the two-state solution, as we saw with the previous administration, usually act and speak with great focus, determination, clarity, and commitment and persistence in ways that proponents of two states simply don't. And of course, there is that cost. And so, while we're seeing things like, yes, the administration has said it's an occupation. I haven't heard them say that the goal is to end the occupation, but that's just me nitpicking. But what we haven't seen really is a clear reaffirmation of the rules-based order that underpins this entire process and that has for the past half century or more. Things like the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force, Resolution 242 and Land for Peace, a focus on international humanitarian law. These are all things that are within reach of the administration, that there is precedent for with previous administrations, and yet we haven't seen a strong commitment, even in rhetorical terms, beyond sort of generalities. That said, there is some new stuff. And specifically, the administration has kind of developed new language, this kind of formula in which they talk about Israelis and Palestinians deserve equal measures of freedom, security, prosperity, and democracy. That's a new formula. And I think that may be a nod to the progressive wing of the party, but it certainly, I think, at a minimum, creates an opening for we don't know what it means in operational terms, but it creates an opening for a rights-based approach like what this groundbreaking report is pushing for.
Lara, if I could turn to you, you saw in the past couple of days, you heard from this progressive wing of the Democratic Party at the J Street event. You saw Senator Elizabeth Warren essentially arguing for the need for Netanyahu to go. You saw Bernie Sanders talking about the need to condition aid to the Israelis. What's your sense about the shifting conversation about the Israeli-Palestinian issue within the Democratic Party, and the extent to which that shift is going to drive policy in the near or medium term?
Thanks. I mean, that really is the big question, right? We've all been watching at the grassroots level a shift in how people think about Israel-Palestine. The polling that shows over and over that the grassroots of Americans want to see America more, quote unquote, even-handed or more supportive of things like boycotts. And there's been this sort of delay in that becoming part of the policy of elected officials. I think what you're seeing now, and Dr. Booker mentioned the McCollum bill. I mean, I think it's worth noting that Betty McCollum introduced legislation along these same lines for the past 2 sessions. This is the 3rd time it's come up, and this is the first time that it's drawn this kind of larger support. And the current version of it, in some ways, is actually a bigger statement about accountability and about de-exceptionalizing. And it's quite extraordinary that, it's one of the centerpieces of the J Street conference. There's support for it. It's being supported by groups like Americans for Peace Now, groups that in the past have been unwilling really to even discuss beyond the idea of saying, Israel should be more accountable, there should be more transparency. The idea of actual hard accountability has been a red line that no one wanted to touch. And that clearly is shifting. And you're seeing that again with the statements of people like Senator Sanders and Warren. You saw this last year with some willingness to talk about use restrictions by people like Senator Van Hollen. There is clearly a shift in what is part of at least what is allowable within the consensus. And that really, I mean, the test is going to be how far that goes. I don't think anyone thinks it's likely that Representative McCollum's bill will pass into law. I mean, it would be fascinating if it did. And let's be very clear, this bill does not actually impose any consequences in terms of cutting Israel's aid or directly conditioning it. But what it does is it de-exceptionalizes it by saying it is okay. It is not only okay, it is necessary to ask for transparency about how U.S. aid is being used, about what U.S. aid is subsidizing, because money is fungible, something that Congress understands incredibly well when it comes to conditioning Palestinian aid, but seems to say, no, 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 we can't have any say at all on Israeli aid. This is really part of what appears to be a sea change from 20 years ago till today in how people think about Israel, and whether or not Israeli impunity in how it uses U.S. aid is an entitlement, and an entitlement that the U.S. Congress will defend against anyone who suggests otherwise. And here again, I want to focus on the word de-exceptionalizing. Daniel used it. That is the key. There are people who will argue that this is, anti-Israel, anti-Semitic progressives, demanding that Israel be held to a different standard, a higher standard. And for people who would say that, I would beg of them, read McCollum's bill and read the Foreign Ops bill. Read in legislation the sort of oversight, forget conditions for a minute, just the sort of oversight that Congress exercises when it comes to spending U.S. taxpayer funds in every other context. And it's not that there's a single kind of oversight. It's different in Egypt, it's different for Jordan, whatever the concerns are. Israel is the only country where we say, we're going to give you a ton of money every year. And not only are we not going to ask for any oversight, any accountability on how you use it, but we're going to attack anyone who suggests there should be that. So I think we really are seeing a shift, and that shift is about de-exceptionalizing. And that actually goes back to where we started with this whole report. The rights-based approach is not about creating some new tool to treat Israel unfairly and attack Israel and people who care about Israel. This is about saying we live in a rules-based system, and those rules matter, and the U.S. helped create a lot of those rules and defends them as part of who we are as a nation. We defend them, and we try to defend them domestically and abroad. And those rules apply everywhere. And they, for some reason, we have a culture, a political culture, which says they apply everywhere but Israel. And this is about saying what a rules-based approach says, a rights-based approach says those rules apply in Israel as well. And we're going to center that as opposed to deliberately marginalizing that for political purposes.
The Trump administration seems to have accelerated this conversation about a rights-based approach to a certain extent, given its acts and the ways it's leaned its fingers very hard on the side of the scales, and at least one particular scale, to jumble that metaphor. But to what extent, and the authors of the report note this in the report, that we are dealing with a situation that has a lot of handmaidens. Previous administrations brought about the context that we're now in as well, and of course President Biden is very much a figure of that legacy also. And I don't know who wants to take this up, but I mean, to what extent does achieving this new rights-based approach require a degree of soul searching in the Washington foreign policy establishment? Maybe that's a question for Khaled or Lara or Salih, whoever wants to take it up first.
I think it absolutely is a matter of soul searching, because as you suggested, we could not have gotten to Trump had previous administrations not paved the way. Let's not forget the two big moves that Trump did: move the embassy to Jerusalem and shut down the PLO office. I mean, two of the bigger moves. Those were based on laws passed in the 1990s at the height of the Oslo process. And so, the groundwork had been laid for years by Congress, certainly, but even by previous administrations who had eroded 242 and Land for Peace and ending the occupation. We don't like settlements, but they're not an obstacle to peace. Well, then why do we not like them? We don't like settlements, but go ahead and build in settlements A, B, and C, because they're really important to your domestic constituencies in Israel. So we have been eroding these rules over decades. What Trump did was simply take, crumple it up and throw it away and say, well, we don't have to pretend anymore to go along with these rules. We could just have this clarity of there are no rules. And that's why it's really, really important to reaffirm the rules with as much clarity as the previous administration eliminated them.
And I think there was a slight historic sort of parallel with the anti-apartheid movement and the legislation that imposed sanctions on South Africa, ultimately to get rid of its apartheid system. During the first part of the second term of Ronald Reagan, the U.S. very explicitly embraced South Africa as a strategic ally. There was nuclear cooperation, covert cooperation, all kinds of arms deals, etc. And it was thought, oh, the Congress will never, be able to react against this. But there was a sudden, sea change of public opinion during the Reagan second term. And of course, his veto of the sanctions legislation was actually overturned by the Senate. And it's an exceptional historical case where this confluence of interest in the United States finally goes back to a human rights-centered approach, saying that U.S. foreign policy and U.S. taxpayers' monies and national resources must be applied in our foreign policy consistent not only with our values and our human rights obligations, but also with our own existing laws, which are already there to restrict how U.S. funding can be used if human rights are being violated.
And I would just also add, in terms of that soul searching, this actually, it reaches to us at home as well. The Biden administration is having to contend with a domestic political calculus right now, which says when progressives criticize Israel, particularly if they're progressives of color or are Muslim, they are called anti-Semitic. And the Democratic Party is accused of being anti-Israel or anti-Semitic if it dares say things that maybe 10 years ago everyone agreed on, like there is an occupation and, the Palestinians should have a state or settlements are bad. It has been the failure of successive administrations and successive leaders in our political system on both sides of the aisle to stand up to this idea that the conflation of criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism has become something which is really poisoning the progressive party, the Democrats and progressives internally. It's creating schisms, particularly between people of color and the rest of the party and Muslim Americans. And I mean, it's devastating. And this is not something that the Biden administration is going to be able to somehow finesse, right? The battle over the definition of anti-Semitism right now is about whether or not it's okay to criticize Israel, fundamentally. And they're going to have to deal with this because they're going to have to name a special envoy for anti-Semitism soon. And that entire battle will end up being about whether or not it's okay to criticize Israel, including asking for Palestinian human rights to be dealt with and asking for accountability. So there's going to have to be some really deep soul searching. And this is going to really come down to a question of spine, of political courage.
Great. So just a reminder to the audience, you can ask a question in the YouTube function of the chat. You can also tweet us at Carnegie Endow using the Ask Carnegie hashtag. I'd like to bring back Daniel, Zaha, and Marwan for the last 50 minutes of our discussion. We have a number of questions filtering in from the audience. Let me take up this one, and it's from Marcus Hallinan. He asks, would Palestinians be better served by seeking a new peace broker, country or countries, to the conflict and sidelining the United States as that traditional broker? Marwan, would you like to take that, or Zaha, would you like to take that up? Marwan, I believe you're muted.
Sorry about that. I don't think it's practical to say that you're going to sideline the United States. That's not going to be a starter to arrive at conflict resolution. What the report does say is that the United States needs to work with multilateral bodies and that it cannot just alone lead the peace process in the way it has done so. In the past, we've had some very useful bodies like the Quartet, where the UN was involved, where the European Union was involved, where Russia was involved, and these are useful bodies to agree on an international consensus regarding the process. But I don't think it's practical to sideline the United States altogether.
Daniel, I see your hand raised.
Yes. No, I mean, I agree with Marwan. I also think it's important to acknowledge that there's not this queue forming somewhere of countries like, oh, can we have a run at this? It looks like tremendous fun. No one's really volunteering. But what you do have occasionally is coalitions of the willing who are ready to take certain steps. And one of the things that this maximum impunity predisposition of America in its policy has had is to make sure no one else can do anything. And rather than using a very also rather kind of dead body like the Quartet, rather than using the Quartet so that other Quartet partners can do things that maybe the Americans are less comfortable doing, it does the opposite. And it maintains a domination and a soloism. So to the extent to which there's an appetite to be a little more forward-leaning along the lines that we're, for instance, discussing, that is actively discouraged and pressured against by the US.
In the report, you guys also talk about the need for the US to be present and active in this process we're seeing unfurl right now with these upcoming Palestinian elections, and for the U.S. to be participating in some way in making the PA a more functional institution. What role could you think the Biden administration could have in this? What should the PA be, and how closely should we be following these elections as they take place in the coming weeks and months? I guess, Zaha, that's to you.
Thanks. You're right. We haven't seen elections in Palestine in 15 years. So there actually is a lot, excuse me, a lot of enthusiasm for elections, particularly among young people who have never voted in their lifetimes because of the failure to hold elections after the schism of 2007, which brought out the political fragmentation and the geographic fragmentation between Gaza and the West Bank. There's a lot that the U.S. can do to support and encourage the elections. First of all, it's been pretty silent. We haven't heard a lot of, support just in public statements by the administration for, Palestinian elections and democratic renewal. We haven't heard that. So just even sort of the moral support would be important, because it would signal to Israel that the U.S. is behind this. Tangible things that the U.S. could do would be, first of all, this is an election that's going to take place under occupation. In, the occupied territories where you've got Gaza and the West Bank, and two disconnected enclaves, basically, where elections have to happen. You have Israel controlling checkpoints and the movement of people and candidates. You have them preventing, candidates from campaigning in East Jerusalem. You've heard them say that they will not allow voting in East Jerusalem under past modalities. So the U.S. could be engaged here with Israel to ensure that, that there's voting in East Jerusalem, that Palestinians in East Jerusalem are allowed to vote in East Jerusalem. The Palestinians won't have elections, they said, if East Jerusalemites, on the other side of the wall that, Israel controls aren't allowed to vote. And so let's not use that as a reason why we don't have elections. The U.S. could be engaged with Israel and making sure that there's voting there. It could be supporting the elections in terms of sending observers and encouraging other countries to send observers, and working with the Palestinians to figure out, what to do if Israel digs its heels in and doesn't allow elections take place. There's been some talk of, opening up, other offices, other missions in East Jerusalem to allow Palestinians to go vote there, or other creative solutions around what's going on with trying to prevent Palestinians from voting in East Jerusalem. And we've also seen candidates being arrested or interrogated. And so having the U.S., just talk to Israel and play interference for the Palestinians on the elections would go a long way to supporting, elections that haven't taken place in so many years there.
Khaled, do you have any thoughts on the Palestinian elections?
I mean, I think Zaha laid it out, I think, pretty clearly. I'm not sure that the United States is all that keen on seeing Palestinian elections because of the potential. I mean, there's just too many variables, right? I mean, what if you get another Hamas victory, or at least a heavy blow to Fatah and Mahmoud Abbas? That's highly problematic, and of course, requiring the United States to have to weigh in on sensitive issues like East Jerusalem. Not that it shouldn't, but we're seeing the U.S. again. I think it doesn't match with the sort of minimalist approach of the Biden administration to want to do the heavy lift on something like voting in East Jerusalem, for example.
We have a question from Ori Neer. He asks, are you not concerned that shifting to a rights-based approach would serve as an excuse for this and future U.S. administrations to abandon diplomacy? That seems to be a loaded supposition, but let me direct it to Salih. What do you make of that question?
I'm sorry, was that to me, Ishaan?
Yes, that's to you. The question is, are you not concerned that shifting to a rights-based approach would serve as an excuse for this and future U.S. administrations to abandon diplomacy?
No, I don't think so at all. I think a shift to a human rights-based approach is actually going to require a bit more diplomacy, because it requires transparency and accountability in support of a human rights approach, commensurate with this enormous investment of U.S. national resources. So, a human rights-based approach doesn't say we're stepping away from Israel and Palestine and we're just going to monitor and pay attention. It requires active engagement, that if we're going to sustain the relationship, including the different levers of influence, which are security sector assistance on one side and diplomatic support as well as the asymmetrically small amount of resources invested in supporting the Palestinian side, it's going to require the State Department and the executive branch and the Congress to be more engaged in diplomacy and to explain what consistency means when it comes to a human rights-based approach. I referred to laws that are already on the books that require the U.S. to have human rights criteria when determining the implementation of foreign policy. And this approach is simply saying that the U.S. must respect its own laws as well as its interests and values.
I see Lara and Marwan both have their fingers up. Lara, do you want to go first?
Sorry, just to say very briefly, and this is something I've said to friends of mine in Europe before, the idea that centering law and rights makes things more complicated, I think is actually a misunderstanding of how diplomacy works. What has made U.S. policy so burdensome and so politically difficult over the many, many years on Israel-Palestine is that everything is done on an ad hoc basis and essentially has to be justified each time and explained from some sui generis sort of approach, right? It comes out of our love and this is better. And each time you have to build an entire argument that from nothing, because essentially you're trying to argue for why the normal rules don't apply and this is why we're doing that. In theory, actually moving to an approach based on law and rights, things that we've agreed on, makes this much easier to conduct as an area for conducting diplomacy, because in effect, here's what's happening, here are the laws. Our policy flows ineluctably from those laws, from those rules. This is, whether it's UN, UN resolutions or international law. This really should be something that people would welcome as something that makes it easier to conduct diplomacy, not harder.
And Marwan?
Can I add to that and just say that the report is not by any means suggesting that we abandon diplomacy, but rather guide it. The report is not a replacement to diplomacy, but a new way to make diplomacy more effective, is my first point. My second point is, it's not like we do have today active diplomacy that has resulted in any positive development on the peace process. There is no diplomacy to speak of. And perhaps one reason that there is no diplomacy is that the framework we have used so far has really failed in getting us to a resolution. What we are suggesting is a new framework that is rights-based, that in our opinion is going not just to guide diplomacy, but actually arrive at a better result for both communities.
Of course, the diplomatic achievement that the Trump administration and its officials hang their hat on now was the rapprochement that we saw between the Israelis and a handful of Arab states. So we have a question here from Abdullah Antepli. He asks, is it wise for the Biden administration to pursue a continuation of the Abraham Accords? If the Accords are revised, could that be productive and help both sides? That's two different questions. Maybe Daniel, do you want to take this up and we can go from there? And for the rest of you, please raise your hands if you have things you want to add.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we have to acknowledge that the design of these particular accords came from the production house of Jared Kushner, Benjamin Netanyahu, and those in the region who went along with it. Now, either it was a make you an offer you can't refuse. So if you're sitting in Rabat, if you're sitting in Morocco, and America is offering to overturn its own international position, to undermine international law on Western Sahara, of course you're going to grab that. If you're in Sudan and you've been unable to get the attention of the administration for an incredibly fragile transition that you're going through that America should have been backing, then of course you're going to go for that. If you're in the Gulf, then something else was going on, I think. And this was designed to be something that could be used to marginalize the Palestinians. And if something is designed to be a tin opener, then it's unlikely to work as something you can paint flowers with. So the design of these accords does not lend itself to being conducive to advancing peace. The idea that was on offer in the past was, Israel, you want normalization with the region. There's a gentleman in this room who kind of knows a lot about, in this Zoom room, who knows a lot about this, Marwan, because you were one of the outreach guys of the Arab Peace Initiative to Israel, as you'll remind us maybe. But there was an attempt in the past to say, Israel, you want normalization with the region around you. These are the steps you have to take. That was the Arab Peace Initiative. This turned that on its head. So I think constructive, no. I know people will say maybe it can give some leverage, but I don't see it myself.
And just to add very quickly, Ishaan, to this, basically the bottom line is normalization with Arab states should not come at the expense of peacemaking. What normalization has done so far is to give Israel the false impression that it does not need to come to terms with the Palestinians if it can forge relations with the rest of the Arab world. In the end, it is the Palestinians who are living under occupation amongst the Israelis. And if you don't come to terms with them, it does not matter whether you normalize with every single Arab country. That is the yardstick, if you want. Normalization is each country's prerogative, but it should not come at the expense of peacemaking.
Well, thank you. We're right up against the clock. This is a conversation I'd love to continue moderating for another hour, but let me turn it back to you, Marwan, and thank you all, and thank you for having me to the Carnegie Endowment.
Thank you very much, Ishaan, for this. Thank you to the rest of the panel for a really rich and lively discussion. I urge all of you to read the report in full, and I hope you find it useful, and I hope you will find in it fresh ideas that are worth considering. That's all we have for now. Thank you very much for listening.